Continue. So once again, thank you very much for joining our webinar today. My name is Rathin Sinha. I'm the founder of JOBfindah Network and the moderator for today's webinar. I'll introduce our guest speaker and, time permitting, take questions. Today's webinar, if we can move to the next slide, is hosted by JOBfindah. Organizations across the country use JOBfindah for easy-to-use job posting, distribution, outreach, and reporting for federal contractor, OFCCP compliance, and diversity recruiting. In addition, JOBfindah services are used by businesses for custom-built recruitment marketing and technology to power their recruiting out results. Our topic today is what to expect from the OFCCP in 2021. For the new administration, racial justice and gender equality are in focus, as is its emphasis on diversity, inclusion, pay equity, and several other labor-friendly regulations. From recruiting to retention and growth, these changes will impact your human resources significantly and is important to be prepared ahead. Shafeeqa Giarratani, next slide, please. An award-winning attorney and shareholder and member of the board of directors of the law firm Ogletree Deakins in their Austin office, is uniquely qualified to help us navigate through the issues and help prepare current audits as well as future audits. Shafeeqa regularly advises clients on affirmative action, legislative and regulatory changes affecting employment matters for federal contractors and Office of the OFCCP compliance issues, from developing affirmative action plans to representing companies during the audit process. So Shafeeqa has been recognized as a super lawyer in many years and has been recognized as one of the best lawyers in the country. She received her AB from Harvard University and JD degrees from Harvard Law School. So now, without further ado, let me hand it to our speaker, Shafeeqa Giarratani. It's all for you, Shafeeqa.
Great. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to JOBfindah for having me here today. And thanks to all of you for joining in. We have got a jam-packed agenda, so we are just going to dive in to all that we can expect this year, 2021, from the OFCCP, and I think you're going to find it's going to be quite a bit of changes. So here's our agenda over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. I'd like to first set the stage so you can understand a little bit about who the leadership is right now and how that's going to impact what the agenda will be for the OFCCP in 2021 and beyond. I'm going to look into my crystal ball and start talking and give an educated and informed guess on what you all can expect from the OFCCP this year. And then we're going to end with really some practical steps and tips that you can take now to prepare your organization. So let's start by setting the stage. Who is the new leadership that we have in place, starting from the very top? Of course, now our president is Joe Biden. And I took this quote because I think that it really sets the stage for what we can expect from this administration throughout the Department of Labor and specifically the OFCCP, which is right away, right after the inauguration. One of the first orders of business for President Biden was to do away with an executive order regarding diversity training and certain diversity training that was stated by the prior administration to be divisive. Well, he took that away, and we'll talk about it more in a moment, and replaced it with really a whole government approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when he did that at the signing, there's a whole transcript at the White House signing that you're welcome to look at on the internet. But here's the quote I quote. He said that I will be reaffirming the federal government's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, and building on the work that we started in the Obama-Biden administration. a lot in his statement upon that revocation of the prior executive order, but I think that when I look at this idea of building on what we started in the Obama administration, keep that in mind as we talk about what to expect. We saw what the Biden administration did before, and what this administration is telling us is he plans to take that and go a step further. And I think that really sets the stage for what we can expect from the OFCCP this year and beyond. Well, our likely Secretary of Labor, and I say likely because he has passed through some committees, but still has some confirmations to go, is Marty Walsh. And Marty Walsh is the current mayor of Boston, served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And what's important as well, and I think one of the reasons why he has been selected by this current administration, is he was the president and a very heavy supporter of the union. One of the things that our current president, President Biden, has said is that he is going to be the most supportive of labor and union issues of any president. So we'll see all what that means, but we do have a Secretary of Labor that we know is going to be very union friendly, and I think in many aspects very employee friendly as well. So who else is up in terms of DOL appointees? Well, we've got a couple of here for your knowledge, and the slide deck I know will be shared. But the important one, of course, that we'll be focusing on for our time here together is Jinny Yang. Now, Jinny Yang has already been appointed as the new head and director of the OFCCP because she doesn't have to go through all the same approval processes as the head of the Department of Labor. She's in, not waiting anymore for her. I put here her bio from the website, but what I wanted to do is highlight for you all just a few key aspects of her experience that are going to be, I think, important and pivotal to the type of administration that we have under President Biden and under now Director Yang. So here's what you should know about Director Yang. She certainly comes with a wealth of experience. And some of the key experience that she had is she actually served in the Obama administration as the EEOC chair for 3 years from 2014 through 2017. And she even had some prior experience in the EEOC before that. While she served in the EEOC, one of her key focus areas was really around pay, and a couple of points to be aware of. She actually spearheaded the Obama administration's effort around that EEO pay data collection tool. You all will remember when we were all preparing from component 2 of the EEO-1 form, where all employers really were going to have to submit pretty comprehensive data to the EEOC. Well, that was spearheaded by Director Yang, and I think really forecast the type of focus that she is going to have at the OFCCP. On top of spearheading that effort at the EEOC around that component 2 of the EEO-1 form with the pay data collection, she also testified in 2019 before the House Committee on Education and Workforce. And the issue that was presented was the Paycheck Fairness Act. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. But when she testified, and she gave pretty powerful testimony in support of that act, what she emphasized over and over again is her belief that federal law at this time simply isn't doing enough to address the gender pay gap and how much further we needed to go. She also pointed out things in the way that pay is looked at by the federal government. And she said things like market compensation rates, so what the market is paying, and things like negotiation really shouldn't justify these salary differentials that she said that we continue to see amongst men and women in our country. So pay, we know, is going to be a big issue for the Biden administration, and certainly it has been for Director Yang in the past. What else do we know about Director Yang? There was published while she was in the EEOC really 3 strategies that she put forth in an article along with others to advance equity. And here are the things that were pointed out and it can give us some clues into what type of director Yang will be. She talked about doubling the EEOC's budget and said that it really wasn't enough, the money that they had and the resources to really enforce existing laws and to do the job that she thought that needed to be done. Also part of the focus in that paper was on identifying systemic discrimination. And I want you to keep that in your mind as well, because that we have seen said from President Biden time and time again already, and in the Democratic National Convention agenda items is this idea of identifying and rectifying systemic discrimination. The way that it was talked about in this paper that now Director Yang did was coming up with complaint systems and really good programs to protect workers and find the power disparities between the employer and the worker. And she also talked about really making sure that there was accountability with employers so that they provided actionable solutions themselves and replaced discriminatory practices with new systems. Now, knowing all of that, who our leadership is, this focus on pay, a focus on systemic discrimination, and coming right out of the gate with taking away prior Trump administration, what can we all expect over these next 12 months from the OFCCP? Well, a few things, looking into my crystal ball, which we'll be talking about this afternoon. So the first is we're going to see a rescission of some of the Trump administration initiatives. We've already started to see those. I mentioned one, I'll be talking about others, but certainly a rolling back of some of the things that we saw. I think that we can bet on, and I don't even need my crystal ball for this one, more rigorous enforcement. Back to the Obama administration, I think, type of enforcement, probably a lot of the look and feel of that, and I'll be going into some more detail about what you can expect. And then I've already set the stage for this. Compensation is going to be big. I think in this new OFCCP that we'll see now and throughout the Biden administration. And we might also expect a pay data collection tool. I'll be talking about that too. A couple of other things, AAP verification, something that was started a bit or talked about under Craig Lean. I think that will be a continued focus, as well as always the hiring focus that the OFCCP has, but I think it's going to be reinvigorated. So let's dig into some details, shall we? Okay, first of all, I think we will see a rescission of some of the Trump administration and the Craig Lean initiatives. So what exactly does that look like? Well, like I said, really first out of the gate, we saw a rescission of Executive Order 13950. And many of you all will remember, because this had the contractor community as well as others, really a lot of discussion points. So this was the executive order that talked about certain diversity training as being prohibited. That was revoked, has been revoked, and it was revoked quickly by President Biden. What the OFCCP has stated is that it's not going to enforce any of the provisions of that executive order or require that there be any of the clauses contained in government contracts and subcontracts. Now, prior to the revocation, there had already been, if you'll recall, there was a hotline set up where employees and others could call. There was an email address and make complaints that their employer or an employer had been violating and doing these certain types of diversity trainings. Well, the frequently asked questions are no longer on the website. That's been rescinded. That hotline has been shut down, as well as the email address. And the OFCCP has said specifically that it will be administratively closing out all of the complaints without any further investigation. And so we can clearly say that Executive Order 13950 is closed and shut. That is rescinded, as well as any complaints that came with it. But here's what was, I think, interesting and gives us some insight into what we might see over the course of this next year. So the executive order that rescinded 13950 on diversity training had more in it than just the rescission. It's actually called the Executive Order on Advancing Racial Equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And President Biden, when he signed this executive order, as I said, gave a speech. But even in that executive order, it calls for what he says is a whole government initiative to advance racial equity. And certainly some of this came from the many issues and concerns and attention that was raised to racial equity this spring and summer and beyond. And what President Biden has said is this is an all hands on deck situation. And he has directed federal agencies to review all of their agencies and deliver an action plan within the next 200 days to address any type of unequal barriers that they see in their agencies. There's also a working group that's now been put together to look at data and look at where there are problems that the federal government itself has in collecting demographic data like race, gender, veteran status, and individual disability status, and make sure that that data is collected in a very good way so that the federal government can take a hard look at itself. It also directs that agencies engage with underrepresented minorities and other communities to ensure that there is a full partnership. And the executive order goes on to say that the OMB must deliver a report to President Biden within 6 months to describe specific methods to combat barriers to racial equity and recommend changes. So I think, again, I think that this executive order, which again I said came right out of the gate, sets the tone for this administration. A focus, as I said, on pay, which we'll be talking about in a moment, but also advancing racial equity with an all hands on deck type of call and looking at the federal government itself first. What else has been rescinded already? And remember, we are quite early, certainly in this administration. Well, many of you all will recall that there was an executive order that was put out, and information from Director Craig Lean that he wrote himself discussing how the religious exemption could apply to certain executive orders. Although it was never said specifically, I think it was understood by many communities that that religious exemption may apply to non-discrimination mandates against the LGBT community. Well, there was actually a suit in the Southern District of New York challenging that executive order, and the Biden administration sent a notice to the court where that is standing and said, we plan to propose a rescission to that. And the notice indicates that process is going to require a notice and comment period, so it might take us several months, but notifying the court and the litigants within that court that the plan is to rescind that particular religious exemption and the focus on it. I think that what we can expect and what this should tell us about this administration is that the balance of religious liberty versus perhaps LGBTQ issues is going to be different in this administration. Certainly no surprises there, but right out of the gate, we can see that that is on the top of the agenda. A couple more things to be aware of in this same vein, not necessarily applying to federal contractors, but I think showing what the agenda will be of this administration. So there was a ban on transgender individuals serving in the military under the Trump administration. That has been rescinded. There's also a new executive order that's already been enacted by President Biden on preventing and combating discrimination and sexual orientation. And what it does is under Title IX of Education Amendments and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it does include discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. So certainly non-discrimination towards the LGBT community, something that we saw in the Obama-Biden administration. Again, knowing Biden is building on that, is now back, and I think we will see some enforcement in that area from the OFCCP to federal contractors. So do expect a return to Obama administration standards on LGBTQ non-discrimination as well as enforcement. So what else can we say is rescinded or gone? And one of the areas, and this is not a straight rescission, but I think that we are going to see is during the Trump administration under Craig Lean, remember all of those directives that he had, and there were tons. I remember him saying that the reason why he had all of those directives is because he really wanted transparency between the OFCCP and contractors. He wanted to say exactly what the procedure was, exactly how things were done, so that contractors would know, but could also hold the OFCCP and compliance officers accountable. And remember those executive orders that went through a voluntary resolution process and a preliminary determination notice, so that if there were issues that you would be notified of those beforehand, or even that ombudsman that would work in between contractors and the OFCCP if there were any perceived issues and lack of cooperation. Here's something else I think just to point out before I talk about what we might see under this new OFCCP under Director Yang. And I thought it was a really interesting figure that under the Trump administration, there were only 3 lawsuits. So that's after we get through the notice of violation and there is back and forth between the OFCCP and a contractor and there's no resolution, they can file a lawsuit. Well, only 3 times did the OFCCP under the Trump administration file a lawsuit. 6 suits were filed in the last week of the Obama administration. And I think what that signifies is rigorous enforcement under the Obama administration and lots of back and forth so that there wasn't always cooperation in the end and it had to go to a third party for a suit. I think what we can expect under Director Yang and the Biden administration, just as he said, is a return to build on what was in the Obama administration before. And I think what we're going to see is less focus on compliance assistance and some of these voluntary cooperation measures, transparency, the ombudsman. And one perhaps signaling of this is some of you may have received notice from the OFCCP that the contractor assistance portal, which is just many of the assistance methods that they have, was closed effective Monday for contractors. And they said that will not be needed any longer. Now, that's not to say that there won't be lots of compliance assistance. They certainly have many other measures. But if we are pulling out our crystal ball and guessing what the tone of this administration will be, this, I think, is one additional clue. And ultimately, I think that we are likely to see more lawsuits filed against federal contractors, both because of rigorous enforcement and perhaps of maybe pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of key issues. So what else can we expect in terms of rescission of Trump administration initiatives? Well, this one is one that is brand spanking new, hot off the presses. Some of you all may have seen, some of you all may be rejoicing if you're on this list, is remember the new initiative around focused reviews. So instead of just having a review of your establishment under all of the laws, what happened under the Trump administration and Director Lean was this new initiative that there would just be a focused review based on Section 503 or disability affirmative action or under VEVRA, affirmative action towards veterans. Well, I think the screen changed up a bit. If you guys are seeing that, let me see if I can get us back to where we were.
Looks good.
All right. Was that good? Are we back to where we were?
You can make it bigger.
All right, we were back to where we were. Let's try one more time.
Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay. So one other, well, it looks like it keeps changing out on me. Let's try it again.
Good.
Perfect. Thanks, Rathin. Okay. So one other area is those focus reviews like we were just talking about. And here's the interesting thing, I think, is there were a ton of them. If you looked on the 2020 CSAL list, or that heads up letter that comes out that says who is scheduled for a review, get ready. 1,750 on that list were either these focused reviews or the compliance checks, which were much quicker, not the full-blown audit. And I think what's interesting is that was 80% of them. So quite a lot were going to be these focused reviews and compliance checks. Well, just 2 days ago, the OFCCP revised that CSAL list, our heads up letter, to remove the focus reviews and the compliance checks, much to the rejoicing of folks that were on the list for those types of reviews. So what is that all about? Why would they do that? Well, here's what the OFCCP officially stated. It stated we learned a lot of lessons from the focused reviews and the compliance checks that we did, and we will be using those to focus greater resources on the establishment audits that we already had on the CSAL list. But I think that there is some behind the scenes baseball here, and some reading between the lines that I will share with all of you, which is this. The focused reviews on Section 503, Disability Affirmative Action, and VEVRA, Veterans Affirmative Action, really most of the time, perhaps, if there's a finding of violation, it would have been to do greater outreach, perhaps record keeping, but those are not the types of pay discrimination cases or hiring cases that lead to systemic discrimination findings or financial penalties. And I think that what we can take away from this is the fact that those are out and the focus is on the systemic discrimination cases under Executive Order 11246 that are hiring and pay shows right where the OFCCP is zeroing in right now. Now, does that mean that there's going to be less focus on individuals with disabilities and veterans? Certainly, I think that there could be some dialing back of that. I think it'll continue to be important to the OFCCP, but I think that we can see that they've got their eyes on the ball in terms of systemic discrimination, hiring, and compensation. And when we look at this move, it shows us just that. So that brings us to compensation. I already talked about how Director Yang's background is certainly in compensation. This is what she pushed in terms of the pay data collection tool when she was at the EEOC and testified about in 2019. We are going to see compensation be a big deal in 2021 and beyond with the OFCCP. So when we talk about compensation, I think there's really two things I want you to be aware of. I do think that there will be some type of pay data collection tool that will be proposed at some point on a federal level. Now, will that come out of the EEOC? Will that come from the OFCCP? Yet to be seen. But what is it going to look like, this tool? And I think that it may look like a resurrected EEO1 component 2 pay data collection tool, which we all saw before, which required us to submit data based on bands and EEO1 job categories. I also point to the new California pay data report that those of you that have operations in California, I'm sure hopefully are getting on the ball and are ready to submit your report by the end of this month. Parts of it, I think, mimic something of the EEO1 pay data collection tool in that it does require disclosure of company data and employment data by bands, job category, hours worked, like we saw in the EEO1 pay data tool, and job categories to kind of mimic the EEO1 categories. Now, my computer is showing that we are having some technical difficulties again with not seeing
It's fine. No. Oops. Get back one more time, please.
Do you see it up now?
No, we don't. Fine. Good now.
Okay. So the Paycheck Fairness Act has just been reintroduced. And I pointed out when we talk about the pay data collection. Paycheck Fairness Act has had several components. It was introduced before in 2019, passed the House, didn't get further than that. But I think it's important to know what it's about for many reasons, the fact that it's back, but also because this is exactly the act that Director Yang testified so fervently in favor of. So what it talked about before and now is restricting the use of certain defenses, things like market factors, and really pulling down the factors that we can think about when we are explaining pay. It also talks about transparency around wages, preventing retaliation for disclosure of wages, and interestingly, requiring the EEOC to collect compensation data. So again, pointing out this fact that we likely will see some attempt to resurrect a great gathering of pay data collection tools. So what else? I feel I'm remiss if I don't mention all of the other pins that are in your house when it comes to pay equity law. So don't forget those when you're thinking about compensation. But I think when we think about compensation, not only is there this issue of what data the OFCCP and the Biden administration might ask for, but the biggest issue has always been, how are they going to look at your data? Not only what are they going to get, but what are they going to do with it? And here is the balance I think that we've seen in different administrations, and it's come down to two basic ideas. The first is, who is being compared against who? Those of you that have been in this world for some time will remember all the acronyms that we've had, from SSCGs to PAGs. All of those are different ways of saying, what is an apple-to-apple comparison? And remember that the OFCCP can be more aggressive or less aggressive depending on who it says is similar in jobs. The more individuals that are determined to be similar, the greater chance of a discrimination finding. I do think in this administration, we will see perhaps a return to some of what we saw in the Obama administration of a widening of who is actually compared. So that's the first part of any type of pay audit. Who are our apples and who are the other apples? And the second part is, how can we defend ourselves? So what are the factors that are going to be deemed acceptable to explain when there's any disparities? And this is always the push and pull in the OFCCP and frankly in any compensation analysis. One of the things, remember when I said that Director Yang said that certain factors, and when she talked about the Paycheck Fairness Act in 2019, she said that certain factors should not be acceptable, including things like market factors. I think that in this new OFCCP for 2021 and beyond, we're going to see a return to some of the Obama administration, but certainly a much tighter understanding of what factors are going to explain pay differentials, and I think probably not in favor of many factors being able to explain pay differentials. Other things that we can expect from 2021 and on the horizon and beyond. Remember that Director Lean in the fall of 2020 released an AAP verification proposal. And what it said is that the OFCCP now had a tool where contractors could say, we have done our affirmative action plan, and could also upload their affirmative action plan. Now the proposal was still in the works. It said there'd be 90 days to comply once finalized, and that certification might be annually, it might be every 2 years. You might have to upload your affirmative action plan, you might not. But out there was this idea that federal contractors needed to certify and perhaps even submit their affirmative action plan. I do think that's already in the works, and I think that it's here to stay and will probably gain some traction. Remember, under the Obama administration, Director Hsu talking about the fact that there were many contractors out there that were receiving funds that didn't comply with their obligations. And so I think when we're talking about building on the Obama administration's work with the Biden administration, that will be an agenda item continued forward. Now, there's always, I think, enforcement and certainly a focus on hiring in the OFCCP. That is what I call their bread and butter. But it certainly, I think, will be even more so in the 2021 OFCCP and the OFCCP under Director Yang. Remember how we talked about those focused reviews are gone, so we can get straight down to business on hiring and compensation. So what will likely be the focus areas? Well, low-skilled, high-turnover jobs have always been a focus when it comes to hiring types of claims with the OFCCP. And why is that? Those are the easiest types of claims to make. It is more difficult for the OFCCP to bring a case when we have a very high-level mathematician that is very difficult to find versus an administrative assistant or someone on a manufacturing floor. Those types of qualifications can be easier to identify. There are more applicants, and there are more burn insurance so that we have more turnover and more of a case to make. Entry-level positions, for the same reason, are typically a focus. Less qualifications to churn through, more turnover in those jobs. Now, I think we see manufacturing has often been a focus for those reasons that I identified, but we also saw in the Obama administration previously a focus on the industries of technology, healthcare, and education. And I think those are coming back under the Biden administration with the focus. So if you're in those industries, certainly get ready. Steering, I think, was something that we saw quite a bit of in the Obama administration. And remember, steering is this idea that even if we don't see hiring disparities in a particular job, we see disparities in who is in what job. So we see that there are more men in a like job that is one step above and women in a job that is below. And that was an idea that was gaining traction in the Obama administration OFCCP. And I think an important issue to look at. I think that we're going to see more drill down into that particular issue in Director Yang's OFCCP. And also a focus on different tests, which can have a disparate impact. I think we'll see a bit of that as well. So when I talk about this heavy enforcement on hiring, what else might you expect? Well, I think really expansive definitions of potential discrimination. One of the things that we saw in the Obama administration is perhaps sometimes what at the time was considered cutting edge thoughts when it came to discrimination. But when we think about President Biden saying this is going to be a whole government approach, we're going to root out systemic discrimination, I think the all means all here. And so comparisons between different races, like disparities between Hispanics versus Blacks, not just Hispanics versus whites, I think are things that we can expect when we're looking at audits. We've already seen that, more of the same. And even I think some of what we saw of a focus on non-minorities and men as well. I think another thing when we talk about heavy and aggressive enforcement is grouping of positions. Because sometimes, and as we all know in this world, big numbers are bad numbers. When the OFCCP tends to be more aggressive, both in pay and in hiring cases, grouping of more jobs together can lead to higher disparate impact findings. So where we are able to convince the OFCCP, not the AAP job group, but titles, we may see them still combining many different positions, especially on the career ladder. So like engineer 1, 2, 3, grouping all of those, even if they accept the job title type of argument for splitting up a hiring type of case. So how can you get prepared for 2021 and beyond Director Yang's OFCCP? Here are some things that you should start thinking about now to buckle in and get ready. So the first thing is some of the rescissions, right? Update your organization on that. If you had diversity, inclusion, unconscious bias, or training about various privileges, know that that executive order has been rescinded and is permitted. If you are a religious organization that was relying on some of the religious exemption language, that's something to consider whether that is going to have an impact on your policies. Well, what about this rigorous enforcement that I talked about? Let's get ready for that. Certainly, if you were one of those focused reviews or compliance checks, perhaps you are rejoicing, but still do look at your outreach for individuals with disabilities as well as veterans. I think it's important just to inform your management that we will likely see a changing of the tides and a shift with more aggressive audits, more in-depth audits. And we need to be prepared for that, certainly if you're in an audit currently, but also as you prepare for the future and think about the resources that you might need. And I think about how you might push back on certain requests where appropriate, and be ready for financial findings in some cases. Well, how about pay? Like I said, I think that is going to be a huge focus when it comes to this administration. Here is my hit list of what I have found over the years with my clients are the risk factors where you start getting into hot water when it comes to pay equity. And really it's things like not having standards, guidelines, or guidance when it comes to how you set pay, or if you do, not having them be meaningful, distributed widely, or followed. The other risk is not having management training. When we get into an audit and our managers are being asked how pay is done and they have no idea and can't tell us about the factors or the process, that certainly is a problem in an audit, but it points to a greater problem in the organization and can lead to pay equity issues and a harder time defending them. When we have broad scale discretion to give pay, however we choose without certain factors, policies, and guidelines, and subjective decision-making creeps in, that certainly allows the opportunity for bias and discrimination, and the OFCCP, especially this one right now, I think is going to be all over it. When we don't have documents to defend ourselves, even if we were have the greatest explanation in the world, remember, if it's not on paper, it never happened. Failure to document the reasoning behind those pay decisions and bonuses has always been an issue, certainly will be an issue when we have this huge focus on compensation, which I believe we will moving forward. And not communicating those criteria, which goes hand in hand with training and really firm policies. And certainly we never want favoritism in the process. That can certainly point to bias as well. So what can you do to start getting ready? Take a look at your written policies. Hopefully you have them. If you don't, let's have some policies around pay increases and bonuses. And if you do have them, take a look at them, review them, dust those suckers off, and make sure that they are really in line with your policy and they'd be something that you would be proud to show to an OFCCP compliance officer. Make sure that you've got some guidelines around pay that is based on objective and quantifiable factors. And you, of course, want to make sure that you limit subjectivity with objective factors. I've been preaching for many years that we must document the reasoning behind our pay decisions. And I have found in my practice that so many organizations are great at knowing, they certainly know why they fired someone, and oftentimes why they hired someone. But why this person got a 3% increase and this person got a 2% increase 2 years later. They have difficulty finding those documents. And think about, is that the case in your organization? If the OFCCP came, and remember this audit is not right after your pay cycle, it's 2 years later, and asked the question, would you be able to answer, one, and two, would you have a document to support it? And if you don't, think long and hard about how you're going to defend yourself in a pay audit. You want to take a look at your performance evaluation process, make sure it's strong, train decision makers, and of course, if you are not doing periodic pay analysis, let's get on that right away. Doing a pay analysis, especially a regression pay analysis, and I always suggest under attorney-client privilege, is really a pivotal way to protect yourself, to know what the issues are before the OFCCP comes knocking at your door. What about hiring, systemic hiring? How do you get ready for that? Well, it's some of the practices that really always allow us to be ready for an OFCCP audit. We first want to ensure we have good, strong hiring practices, that we've got stated job qualifications, both in our job descriptions and our postings, that those are communicated to our hiring managers, and they're used throughout the hiring process, both in interviewing as well as in how we assess each candidate. We want to look at our disposition codes because those are the meat of any hiring audit. How are our disposition codes being used? Are they being used for every single candidate? I don't know how many times I've been in an audit and 30 to 40% of the candidates never got a disposition code at all. So let's audit, just run those codes, take a look at them. Do we have disposition codes everywhere? Are we using what I call dump codes, meaning another candidate was better qualified? Something that will never help us defend ourselves in an audit. But do that audit, do it soon, that will help you get prepared. And just look at your documentation. Do you have documentation to support your decisions? Run a thorough adverse impact. You certainly want to run it by AAP job group. That's what the OFCCP is often looking at, mostly looking at. Look at job title, consolidate job levels on career ladder like I discussed, compare racial groups against each other, and don't forget to look at non-minorities and men as well. Think about your steering vulnerabilities. Are there certain jobs where you say, gosh, those jobs are somewhat similar, but there's a lot more men or there's a lot more of this particular racial group than in the lower paying job? And consider that, and consider if promotions are appropriate, or if you can explain why that's the case. Look at your testing and think about whether tests have been properly verified for adverse impact. Now, after all this, I say, we're thinking about 2021, but gosh, what a 12 months we have all had. And to think that we have got an aggressive OFCCP coming at us in a worldwide pandemic, how can that be the case? Well, we have seen that the OFCCP has continued desk audits. They have found the technology, just as we all have, allows them to continue on their jobs, and we have really seen business as usual. Now, there's been a national interest exemption for contractors that entered into federal government contracting to help the government during this pandemic period. But for the rest of us, I think what we are going to see as business as usual and a return to what we saw during the previous administration, but building on top of that. So with that, I think we have a few moments for some questions, but judging from before, I don't know if anyone can actually get in the chat. So I will see if you can unmute yourself. Certainly those that would like to ask a question are welcome.